Okay, well, welcome everybody to Gandhi and King, Soul Force and Social Change. We're in the 7th week of our 10-week course. We are discussing Martin Luther King today as he is evolving from a reformer towards becoming more of a revolutionary. My intention today is to spend a little time, at least, discussing Martin Luther King's timeline from after Birmingham, after Montgomery bus boycott, and we will go to 1961, the Freedom Rides, 1962, the Albany Campaign, 1963, the Birmingham Campaign, and the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March. These are very important nonviolent action, militant nonviolence events. And they, as we will see, resulted in extremely important laws being passed by the US national government, which have impacted US society. Tomorrow, Saturday, we will find that there has been a backlash against these laws, and many of their provisions are not being well enforced. So, that said, I would like to spend about 40 minutes, not more, discussing King, the reformer, becoming more revolutionary. And we will see if we have time today to discuss Letter from Birmingham Jail, a famous document, and possibly even listen to part of a sermon by Martin Luther King so you can have the feel of his own expression. No later than about 35, 40 minutes from now, it may be important for us to have some group sessions if we have more people. If it is just the 10 of us, then maybe we will stay in the group as a whole. We will see. So, unless we have more we want to talk about from the past, let us go ahead and begin looking at the timeline that we began seeing yesterday. We see now at the top, I think, this is 1961. King has come back from India. He is healed from the assassination attempt 2 years earlier. And much of this year of 61 is important action not led by King himself. The civil rights movement has a momentum of its own. Let's see here. I see now. Good. The Freedom Rides took place in 1961. What were they? They were bus rides that crossed state boundaries, breaking segregation laws, because this had not been done before. Black and white people crossing in the same bus state lines was generally considered to be not acceptable. And of course, they were segregated buses. So these rides sometimes meant great violence. One of the people I mentioned on that first line of this handout is Jim Peck. Jim Peck was a white man who I knew personally, who was riding the first Freedom Ride as it came into Birmingham, Alabama. The bus was met by the Ku Klux Klan. It was attacked. Jim Peck, seen as a traitor to his race, was pulled out by the white Klansmen and beaten badly. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital with a brain injury. Later, Jim Peck sued the U.S. government for damages for his injuries because he learned that among the Ku Klux Klan that attacked him was an FBI agent who had been in the Klan reporting on its activities. The agent had known about the plan of the attack and had done nothing to stop the attack upon Jim Peck and others. Jim Peck won several $1,000s in damages. It took 10 years for him to receive damages for his injuries. There were the Nashville sit-ins, led by James Lawson and people like Diane Nash. I also met both of them and interviewed them. These were sit-ins at a lunch counter called Woolworth's Department Store. And we could go into detail about the strategy of these activists. James Lawson is a person of note because he himself had studied Gandhi in India. Unlike Dr. King, who went to visit for 5 weeks, James Lawson actually studied about Gandhi in India, and his Nashville sit-ins were very much inspired by Gandhian satyagraha practices. There was also something called the Voter Education Project, run by John L. Lewis. I misspelled that. It's not Lewid. It's Lewis. John Lewis later became a congressman from Georgia. John Lewis deserves to be Googled and understood in his own right. He fought hard to maintain the Voter Rights Act that we'll be talking about, even though it was reduced in effectiveness while he was in Congress. He did his best to keep the right to vote strong for African Americans. In 1962, in Albany, Georgia, there was a campaign where Dr. King was invited, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to desegregate the facilities, public facilities, grocery stores, restaurants in Albany, Georgia. There were over 1,000 arrests by the police chief, known as Mr. Pritchett. But this was not a successful campaign. We can discuss why if you like, but the typical explanation is that Chief Justice Pritchett did not respond violently to the demonstrators. He peacefully arrested them. They were not beaten. They were not attacked. And so the police chief, acting in a somewhat nonviolent, tactical way himself, reduced the moral impact, at least, of the demonstrators. So this is typically seen as a defeat for Dr. King. 1963, we have the Birmingham campaign in Alabama. This was different. First, King was much better organized. There were mass arrests, including children. I interviewed Dorothy Cotton, who was the only woman on King's steering committee, and she was organizing the children for arrest. This was my first experience personally with the civil rights movement, and it came through television. I was 14 years old in 1963, and what I saw were police dogs attacking children, biting them. What I saw was the police chief, Bull Connor, ordering fire hoses to be high-pressure fire hoses to spray water on the demonstrators, knocking them off their feet, and making them hit buildings. This is what I saw. This is what the nation saw. And this had a tremendous impact. There was a lot of TV coverage. King was arrested. He wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, where he defended his civil disobedience campaign against those who were critical of it. There was a mayor campaign happening in Birmingham with a progressive white man running for mayor. That progressive person, who wanted to be an ally of Dr. King, asked him to stop the campaign, allow the election to take place, and if he, the white progressive candidate, won, King would have an ally, and it would be easier, he argued, for them to desegregate the city. King refused. He demonstrated anyway. He violated a court order. He demonstrated without a court permit, and a great many people were arrested. As a result, there was a very successful desegregation, and the consciousness of the American public was dramatically increased as a result of the 1963 Birmingham campaign. He became quite famous, of course, later that same year, 1963, when there was the March on Washington, organized by Bayard Rustin, who we mentioned yesterday, King's friend and very close advisor. The March on Washington had 250,000 people in the capital of the United States. And there is where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So basically, the reformer, Dr. King, had a very successful campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, followed by a very successful march on Washington, D.C., a speech, of course, that is now known throughout the world as one of his better speeches. And this all then led the next year to King receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm moving fast because I'm willing to have people discuss this if they want. But I want us to move forward so we can then discuss the whole pattern. The result of all of this action on part of Dr. King was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits national discrimination based upon race, color, religion, sex, national origin. It also prohibits, you can read this on the handout if you like. So maybe I should just say that. It prohibits discrimination in voter registration. It prohibits discrimination in schools and public accommodations like restaurants and hotels and grocery stores. It prohibits employment discrimination. So now, if you're an employer with 15 or more employees, after 1964, you cannot discriminate based upon in hiring, promotions, or firings. Whether you're a public or private employer, if you have 15 or more employees and you discriminate based upon race, religion, color, or national origin, which is where you were born, you can be punished. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was incredibly powerful piece of legislation. In 1965, King focuses on voting rights. He was arrested along with John Lewis and a few others in Selma, Alabama during a voting rights demonstration, and King and others then decide to make a march. We will march for 5 days from Selma, Alabama to Birmingham, Alabama, which is the capital of the state. It's about 87 kilometers. We will march for voting rights. The first attempt for the march to begin, as they left Selma, they crossed a bridge called the Pettus Bridge. And there, Alabama state troopers on horseback attacked the marchers. They beat them with batons. They hit them with tear gas. John Lewis, who we've already mentioned as later becoming a U.S. congressperson, John L. Lewis was at the march leading it. Dr. King was away that day, and John Lewis was nearly killed. So this was known as Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. Again, the nation was shocked. And the actions of the marchers, Selma to Montgomery, 25,000 arriving in the capital, Montgomery, calling for voting rights, led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you can see that the Birmingham campaign resulted in not only the Nobel Peace Prize, but also with the Voting Rights Act of 64. The Selma March resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are the two greatest pieces of legislation ever passed in the United States to bring equality to Black people and others in the United States. The Voting Rights Act prohibited states from imposing discriminatory practices on the right to vote. They allowed for direct national government intervention in local elections if there had been a history of discrimination. And they even required prior national federal government approval for new laws at the state and local level to assure that they would not be discriminatory in voting. These laws were enforceable, and the king expected them to be enforced with the full power of the national government against state and local governments. We can see the strategy, yes, that we talked about in theory. We have militant nonviolence, that is coercive love, first agitating to create a law, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, then having that law enforced to bring about change. It's a very coercive, powerful strategy from the top down. You agitate, you engage in civil disobedience, you demonstrate to have the laws created, but then when the laws are created, you enforce them. You understand the process. At this point, I will take a very short break to ask if you have some questions that you would like to address. And then we can move on. King's strategy was working. The laws were passed. And as we will see, for a time, the laws were being enforced. The impact of the Voting Rights Act of 65 dramatically expanded African American registered voters. It empowered people to vote without fear. And eventually, it contributed to the election of Barack Obama, the first Black president of the United States. That would not have happened without the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Do you have thoughts at this moment? Well, I will go ahead and move forward a little. And if I do so in a timely way, we may have some time to see a little of Dr. King himself before we have discussion. As you can see on the next slide from the timeline from 1966, yes, Harshal is way ahead of me. King is becoming more revolutionary. Notice, for those of you who are viewing today, as well as who may be seeing the recording of this session, feel free to screenshot this. I typed very slowly, and I was trying to make things very easy for you to read. In 1966, Dr. King moves his attention to Chicago, Illinois. The issue is housing. In January of 1966, King moves into a slum, run-down tenement building in Chicago. He moves in. He lives with the poor. This shows a certain evolution, a little bit more Gandhian. You remember that Gandhi came back from South Africa and eventually stopped wearing suits and donned the dress of a more peasant person during the Champaran campaign in India. Well, King continues to wear some suits, but while he is living with the poor, he mostly wears work shirts, kind of blue shirts, working class, union sort of shirts. In June, he goes back south and engages in a march against fear, because fear is still very much in the South. And July 10th of 66, King begins his campaign to end discrimination in housing, schools, and employment in Chicago. Now, he's not in the South. He's in a northern state, Illinois. And that Chicago is being ruled by a political boss by the name of Richard J. Daley, a white man who had incredible power. And Daley promised changes, but he did not deliver. He was good at making promises and then deciding, that can wait, that can wait. King did not want to wait. And so what he did was he engaged in very assertive marches into Chicago neighborhoods and suburbs. We mentioned this before when he marched into Cicero, an all-white suburb. King and the marchers are hit with bricks and stones. King is trying to reveal to everyone to see on television and throughout the world how racism is present in Chicago and how it needs to be brought out into the open so that it can be dealt with. The efforts of King for open housing eventually lead to the Open Housing Law of 1968, which was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 64. It prohibits public or private discrimination in sale, rental, financing of housing based upon race, color, religion, or national origin. So again, you can see King agitates, a law is passed, he wants that law to be enforced. In 1967, King is becoming increasingly concerned about the Vietnam War. The President Johnson, who helped to pass the big civil rights laws of 64, 65, and 68, he has escalated the U.S. presence in Vietnam. And by 1967, which I might say is when I graduated from high school, I was 18 years old. Many of my friends in high school were being drafted into military action in Vietnam. They did not volunteer. They were forced by their country to go and be trained to kill. At least 6 of my high school friends that I played sports with died in Vietnam. They came back in body bags. This certainly affected me personally, and these casualties, upwards of 60,000 U.S. citizens were killed in Vietnam, were impacting people like Dr. King, who saw white people going to Vietnam to kill non-white people. And oftentimes, Black Americans were also being drafted to kill other non-white people. And this was a war he came to believe not only was unjust and wrong, but it was taking money away from programs for education, for open housing, for healthcare, for other things that poor people in the United States needed. So Dr. King decided to speak out against the war in Vietnam. And here's where I'd like to show at least 6 minutes of that speech so that Dr. King can speak for himself. I hope you can hear it. It is mostly an audio recording. It is subtitled, and I will try to have my camera on the film so that you can read what King is saying as he is saying it. While you're watching this 6-minute film, think, is Dr. King a national security threat? Is he becoming a revolutionary? The language he used scares a lot of people in the white power structure in the United States, including the head of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the chief law enforcement arm of the national government. J. Edgar Hoover came to believe that Martin Luther King was a communist. This speech probably contributed to Dr. King's being killed. So I hope you find this speech of interest, and I will try to be showing it now to you. Let's see here. You can see my computer screen?
Not stable.
Fairly well?
Is it on YouTube?
It is not easily, I can't set that up today. But it's mostly a matter of hearing. So let us hear the speech for 6 minutes.
Okay.
From Washington, D.C., the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. will face the nation.
I'm so sorry. For some reason, this thing simply changed on me. Why?
In order to counteract
Oh, Frampa.
reaction in the forces of our nation.
That is okay. I'm not going to waste time trying to find my mistake, but I will find it. I don't know what just happened. It is on YouTube.
All embracing.
There we go.
Unconditional love for all men. This oft misunderstood and misinterpreted concept.
I'm going to start here.
not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I am disappointed with America. There can be no great disappointment where there is no great love. I'm disappointed with our failure to deal positively and forthrightly with the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. We are presently moving down a dead-end road that can lead to national disaster. America has strayed to the far country of racism and militarism. All men are made in the image of God. All men are brothers. All men are created equal. Every man is an heir to a legacy of dignity and worth. Every man has rights that are neither conferred by nor derived from the state. They are God-given. Out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. What a marvelous foundation for any home. What a glorious and healthy place to inhabit. America strayed away, and this unnatural excursion has brought only confusion and bewilderment. It has left hearts aching with guilt and minds distorted with irrationality. It is time for all people of conscience to call upon America to come back home. Come home, America. I call on Washington today. I call on every man and woman of goodwill all over America today. I call on the young men of America who must make a choice today. Take a stand on this issue. Tomorrow may be too late. And don't let anybody make you think God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant." Now, it isn't easy to stand up for truth and for justice. Sometimes it means being frustrated. When you tell the truth and take a stand, sometimes it means losing a job. It means being abused and scorned. It may mean having a 7 or 8-year-old child asking your daddy, "Why do you have to go to jail so much?" I've long since learned that to be a follower of Jesus Christ means taking up the cross. My Bible tells me that Good Friday comes before Easter. For the crown we wear, there is the cross that we must bear. Let us bear it. Bear it for truth. Bear it for justice. And bear it for peace. Let us go out this morning with that determination. And I have not lost faith. I'm not in despair. I haven't lost faith because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. We will be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when the lion and the lamb will lie down together, and every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid, because the word of the Lord has spoken it. With this faith, We will be able to speed up the day when all over the world we will be able to join hands, singing the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last with this faith. We'll sing it as we're getting ready to sing it now. Men will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not rise up against nations, neither shall they study war anymore. And I don't know about you, I ain't gonna study war no more.
Why is Amazon paying me $63,000 a month? Well, I didn't make this kind of money.
Why are we getting commercials? Anyway, I think Reza has his hand up already. That speech is personally my favorite speech. It happened on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before King was killed. His coming out against the war in Vietnam so forcefully drew a great deal of criticism from his white and black supporters. Many people thought, you shouldn't be speaking against war. The issue is racism. But Dr. King, his thinking was racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are three evils that are all together. One cannot be addressed without the others. And so he lost a lot of support. He received a lot of criticism. President Johnson, who, of course, had been his ally with many of these laws, felt personally attacked because Johnson is the one who escalated the war in Vietnam. So Dr. King was very controversial in this speech. And if you listen carefully, it is as if I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. If you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the power and place it in the hands of a people who don't even know my name. King is being biblical, condemning U.S. military policy and saying that God, through people, will rise up and break the power. Here is where he is coming to be very close to revolutionary. And it is after this, in the last year of King's life, he is increasingly seen as a national security threat. Let us have a little discussion. Reza, you had your hand up. Other people are here. What do you think about King and his speech?
Hello.
Yes, Reza.
Yes, Professor Michael, thank you very much for your nice deliberation. Actually, this speech was very inspiring for us. I usually do not have an opportunity to think and go and search for, especially for a speech of Martin Luther King. This was the first time that I have here. It was very much inspiring and it was very impactful on me. Sir, I want to have a question.
You always have a good question.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, whenever you are speaking about Martin Luther King, so it is necessary that we have to go beyond the Luther King, and we have to think about the context as well. I think the context is very important, that this context produce leaders like Martin Luther King. What do you think about the context that impacted to produce this powerful and this impactful leader in the history of America?
Well, the context of King's speech was President Johnson's dramatic increase in soldiers in Vietnam. By 1967, we had 500,000 U.S. combat soldiers in Vietnam. We were in the process of killing over 2 million Vietnamese people. We were in the process of losing 60,000 U.S. lives. The entire country was being impacted, and Dr. King felt like he had to speak out. I think, Harshal, you will notice that I sent a copy of part of King's speech to be able to for people to see if they want. At some point. There we go. And again, you can screenshot. These excerpts from that speech given at Riverside Church in New York City, you can screenshot and print and be able to look at more carefully. You will notice that in this particular piece, I slightly modified it for use in my classroom some time back. During the War on Terror, I thought that King's speech would also be relevant. And so, as I mentioned in the notes, I substituted whenever King said communism, I used the word terrorism. And updating that, we could see how King's criticism of the United States was the same, basically, from 1967 to 1997 and onwards. He's considered that the United States is becoming an anti-revolutionary force, a policeman for the whole world, protecting the wealthy. He was becoming quite radically disappointed with America and how it was oppressing people around the world. So if you look at the speech that I have printed here, and you compare it, of course, with the words that were said that you just heard, you can begin to see how Dr. King, at the age of 38 years old, was being looked upon by people like my grandmother as being a danger to the United States. This impression was increased when King announced later in 1967 a Poor People's Campaign. As we go back to the timeline, we can see the Poor People's Campaign was to be organized in the summer of 1968, and it would involve massive civil disobedience in Washington, D.C. He was to demand a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, enforced by people's power, including a guaranteed annual income, health care for all, education paid for through college for all who qualify, completely open and affordable housing, and for every employable adult, the right to a family wage job and the right to participate in decision-making processes with an equal vote. These demands were not requests. He was planning to close down the capital of the United States, physically, coercively, close it down until Congress passed legislation at that time that would cost at least $30 billion to provide for and fund these demands. King was becoming very radical. That radicalism is not present in the I Have a Dream speech. You can see it becoming present in Why I'm Against the War in Vietnam. In 1968, while he was organizing for the Poor People's Campaign, he also went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike by garbage collectors, sanitation workers. On April 4th, 1968, King was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Riots took place in 130 U.S. cities. Across the country, there was rioting. He was allegedly killed by one person, James Earl Ray, a white young man who, without any known resources, had been traveling around the country following Dr. King and in his public appearances. I say that because whether or not James Earl Ray himself killed Dr. King by a gunshot is a question. And if he did so almost certainly with support. We now know that when King went out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, an open space, the Memphis police had been called back from protecting him. The police had been providing police protection, and they were called away from their posts at the time that James Earl Ray fired the shot. It's very suspicious. His widow, of course, Coretta Scott King, believed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and J. Edgar Hoover were involved in the assassination, that the U.S. government had helped to kill Martin Luther King. We don't know for sure. Many official records are still classified. And last, of course, 1986, Congress created the National Martin Luther King Jr. holiday that would be celebrated on January 20th of every year. Well, that's great. We have a national holiday for Dr. King. And we hear the I Have a Dream speech time after time after time again. I'm always unhappy on that holiday because we do not hear much about the radical King. We do not hear today on those holidays how King was fighting for a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, how he was demanding a guaranteed annual income and national health care. These are socialist programs. And how he was willing to close down the capital of the United States to get what he believed to be just. At this point, we have 20 more minutes, and I am seeing at this moment there are 13 of us. Shall we have 15 minutes in our breakout rooms? Harshal, do you think that's a good idea?
Yes, let's do it.
What do you think? Was King becoming a revolutionary? Was he the kind of revolutionary you could support? Let us talk about that. Well, our discussion was going strong and the time ran out. I'm hoping there was good discussion in the other breakout room.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, now I hope you are beginning to understand Martin Luther King better. We have looked at his way of looking at the world, his main ideas, and we have looked with some care at the actions he was able to accomplish in his short life, the different campaigns. Tomorrow, we can continue to explore with depth issues of particular campaigns if you want. But for tomorrow, I am also thinking it would be good for us to look at the role of law as King sees it, not just in the abstract. In India, there's a practice of having reservations, yes, for certain disadvantaged people, Adivasis, others, for women. What is King's position relating to using the government and its laws to bring about greater equality for disadvantaged groups? I would like to look at what we call in the United States affirmative action, reserving spaces for people to bring them out of poverty, systematic preferential treatment for groups that have been systematically excluded in the past. We will have arguments for and against, and I think you will find that Gandhi and King are often in disagreement on this issue. So I'm hoping that tomorrow, when we look at King's role of law and affirmative action, we will have some very good discussions. And I look forward to it.